Hello again, and welcome back to our study. This is Pastor Rodney Garcia, and our lesson today is entitled The Symbol of Conversion, and is taken from Romans chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, which says, "Or do you not know that as many of us as were baptized into Christ Jesus were baptized into his death? Therefore we were buried with him through baptism into death, that just as Christ was raised from the dead by the glory of the Father, even so we also should walk in newness of life." As you can see, Paul is writing about baptism in this text. But what I want to point out is that it's not so much for the purpose of explaining baptism as it is for furthering his point in verse 2 based on the meaning of baptism. This is why he begins with the phrase, "Or do you not know?" It's as if he's saying, do you admit the truth of what I have just said? Or do you not realize what your baptism meant? So, what does baptism mean? The first thing we need to consider is whether baptism is the thing that causes our conversion or simply the thing that symbolizes our conversion. To answer this, we'll look at two other statements Paul makes elsewhere. The first is Colossians chapter 2, verses 11 and the first part of verse 12. "In him you were also circumcised with the circumcision made without hands, by putting off the body of the sins of the flesh, by the circumcision of Christ, buried with him in baptism." As you can see, this language is very similar to the language of Romans 6. What I want to point out is that this spiritual circumcision made without hands, Paul calls the circumcision of Christ. He then equates this circumcision with baptism. So, baptism and the circumcision of Christ are one and the same. Now for the second statement. Romans chapter 4 and verse 11. "And he received the sign of circumcision, a seal of the righteousness of the faith which he had while still uncircumcised, that he might be the father of all those who believe, though they are uncircumcised, that righteousness might be imputed to them also." Notice that circumcision is a sign or a seal of having received righteousness by faith, or in other words, of having been justified by faith. Notice the order as well. The justification comes first, then its sign, circumcision. Now, let's draw a conclusion based on both texts. From the experience of Abraham, who is the forerunner of all who are saved by faith, circumcision is an outward sign of what has already taken place inwardly. In the New Testament, circumcision is spiritual and is experienced through baptism. Therefore, in keeping with the parallel, baptism is also an outward sign of what has already taken place inwardly. So now the question is, what is baptism a sign of? What does it symbolize? Well, Paul mentions three things in our text: dying with Christ, being buried with Christ, and rising to new life with Christ. By the way, this is why in the New Testament, baptism is consistently performed by immersion. Dying and being buried is represented by going completely underneath the water, and rising to new life is represented by coming up out of the water. So, before we can experience new life, we must be buried. But before we can be buried, we must die. Again, death is the transition point in conversion. Now, let's go back to Paul's purpose for bringing up this discussion on baptism. Remember, he's trying to further support his point in verse 2. How shall we who died to sin live any longer in it? Or in other words, how shall we who died to sin still live the same old life of sin when death results in new life? Paul's point is that if we have been baptized, we should know this because this is what baptism represents. So far in our study, we have learned that because of God's abounding grace, there is hope for conversion. Conversion is a transition from the reign of sin to the reign of grace in our lives. Conversion changes our address. We used to live in sin, we now live in grace. And finally, baptism is the symbol of conversion and of the change it brings.